I began my run at twilight, right when the sun dipped below the skyline and painted the horizon with shades of gold and purple. Every weekday, I followed the same path. Enter the park near the east gate, jog a loop around the little pond, and exit by the west gate. The routine always felt calming. There were tall lamp posts every 100 feet or so, shining just enough light to guide my way. But last night was different. I stretched at the park entrance as usual. A slight breeze brushed against my arms. The warm day had given way to a cool evening, and the sudden drop in temperature gave me a little shiver. I remember looking up at the sky and seeing a few stars starting to peek through the dim glow of evening. The lamps inside the park glowed in neat rows, forming a trail of mild yellow light that curved around the path. I felt safe knowing my route was lit, even at this hour. As soon as I walked through the gate, I noticed a hush in the air. Normally, even at dusk, I would hear passing cars outside the park, or maybe see other joggers. But the street noise faded away unnaturally fast. I thought maybe it was just a quiet night. Still, a small voice in my mind told me something was off. My gut felt strange, like I had stepped into a different world. But I tried to ignore it and continued on. After all, I had run here many times without any problem. I started my jog, letting my mind wander. My footsteps on the gravel sounded louder than usual, each crunch echoing around me. I passed the first lamppost with no issue, then a second. When I reached the third lamppost, I heard a faint click behind me, followed by darkness. I turned my head and the previous lamppost had gone out. At first I thought there might be a power issue or a bulb failure. But as soon as I started running again, I heard another click, and the second lamppost went dark too. That made my heart skip a beat. The possibility of the lights going out in sequence following my steps felt like a warning. I shook it off, telling myself it must be a weird power surge or some local glitch in the circuit. Still, I felt uneasy. I picked up my pace, trying to brush off the tension. After all, the next lamppost in front of me was still on. But as soon as I passed under it, I heard the same odd click behind me, and then darkness again. It was like the park was pushing me forward, turning out the lights behind me, so I had no choice but to move ahead. I did not want to turn back because I realized the path behind me was now pitch black. My breath grew shaky. It became harder to pretend that everything was just a technical issue. The pattern was too precise. Each lamppost died right as I left it. There were no random intervals. With every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. The path behind me looked darker every time I peeked. The circle of light from the next lamppost was my only comfort. Seeing that glow ahead was the only thing keeping me from panicking. I tried to keep my breathing steady, in through my nose, out through my mouth. The dryness in my throat made it difficult, but I forced myself to stay focused. Running full speed in fear might lead me to trip or get injured. I reasoned I needed to keep a steady pace, keep my eyes open, and find a way out. About halfway through the park, there is a small fountain near the pond. Usually couples sit there, or local dog owners pause to give their pets a drink. But last night, the fountain area was empty, and I could only hear a trickle of water. I slowed down as I neared it. The lamppost beside the fountain flickered but remained on. I considered stopping just long enough to catch my breath and think. Then I heard footsteps behind me. They were soft, like someone was trying not to be noticed, but close enough for me to catch the faint crunch on the gravel. My heart began to pound. I looked back but saw nothing except darkness. The footsteps stopped as soon as I turned around. A wave of cold shivers ran over my neck, making the hairs there stand up. I spun back and continued forward. My pace became a light sprint, and I tried to keep from outright running. I did not want to trip in the dark. I passed the fountain, and the light overhead popped off as I left it behind. That was now the pattern. The lamps switched off one by one the moment I moved beyond them. My only goal was to reach the opposite gate, near the busy street, as quickly as possible. Usually the park gates shut at 10, but they do not lock them. I thought I could just push them open and get out. Still, in my mind, a new fear took root. What if the gate is locked tonight? The question made my stomach feel hollow. The footsteps returned, this time a little faster, matching my speed. I tried to keep my mind clear, but fear gnawed at me. Were they behind me, or were they only in my imagination? I heard a faint rustling in the trees to my right. It could have been the wind, but everything felt so concentrated on me. Then I reached a section of the park with tall hedges on either side, a narrow passage that led to the central walkway. The hedges reached overhead in some places, forming a kind of tunnel. The lamppost here was bright, but the glow did not penetrate far into the tall greenery. Halfway through, the hedge to my left suddenly shook, and I jerked away in fright. I waited, half expecting some stray animal to bolt out, but nothing happened. The lamppost by the hedge flickered a few times, and I dreaded that moment when it would shut off. Before it did, I sprinted out of that narrow stretch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Sure enough, I heard a click behind me, and then the glow was gone. I was now in the central part of the park, near the biggest path. A single wide lane leads to the center fountain before branching off to the other gates. Here, the lampposts are spaced more closely. Usually, it is the brightest area of the park, a place where people gather. But last night it was deserted. Every lamp made a low buzzing sound, an electric hum that felt strangely alive. As I crossed from one pool of light to the next, they dimmed, flickered, then blinked out behind me. The effect was so exact it felt choreographed. I forced myself not to look back anymore. My instincts told me that if I kept looking back, I might see whatever it was that followed me. Or worse, it might get closer while I hesitated. So I stared straight ahead, focusing on the exit. I knew it was about 100 yards away, just past a playground and a cluster of tall bushes. Then a new fear hit me. The playground. After this big clearing, I would pass a small children's play area with a slide, some swings, and a sandbox. At night, it always looked eerie, but this time, I sensed something waiting there. My mind conjured up images of a dark shape leaning on the slide or something swaying on the empty swings. As I approached, the playground area came into view under 2 lampposts. The swings were gently moving back and forth, as though someone had pushed them a moment ago. There was no wind strong enough to move them that way. I slowed my pace, courage draining from me. My legs wanted to bolt, but a sick curiosity made me stare. The dim light revealed both swings rocking out of sync, one slower than the other. The effect was unnerving. I looked behind me one last time. Total darkness stretched all the way back the route I came. I could not see the fountain or the hedges or anything. My heart pounded loud in my ears. What if the darkness was not just an absence of light, but something alive? I gulped and turned toward the playground, deciding to hurry across it. The moment I turned my head forward again, I noticed a figure standing at the foot of the slide. I could not make out details, only that it was tall, motionless, and seemed to be facing me. My throat went dry. My immediate thought was to go around the playground, giving a wide berth. But the lamppost overhead flickered. I had no more time to think. My instincts took control, and I sprinted. I darted off the main path, circling around the play area through the grass. Each step felt heavier, like the ground tried to hold my feet. The entire time I felt a pressure on my back, like a gaze or more than one. My legs ached, but adrenaline forced me on. I hopped back onto the main path just beyond the playground. The figure was no longer in my line of sight, and I did not dare look to see if it followed. Now, the final stretch to the gate was in front of me. 2 lampposts towered near the exit. My mind screamed at me to run faster, to close the gap before those lights failed. I pushed my body, ignoring the burning in my calves. My breath came out in harsh pants. My lungs felt on fire, but fear kept me going. As I neared the gate, I noticed that it seemed closed, but no padlock or chain was visible. Relief washed over me. I reached the tall iron bars and practically threw myself against them, pushing with all my might. The gate swung open with a loud metal screech. I stumbled out onto the sidewalk, losing my balance for a moment. Streetlights greeted me with their comforting glow, and I could hear distant traffic again. I kept going until I made it to the corner of a busy intersection, leaning against a street lamp to catch my breath. My shirt was soaked with sweat, my face flushed. As the normal sounds of the city returned, I realized I had escaped the darkness, but a chill lingered in my bones. I looked back once, down the sidewalk toward the park entrance. The gate stood open, the park beyond it mostly dark, except for a faint flickering lamppost deeper inside. For a few minutes, I just stood there, overwhelmed and shaky. People passed by on the road, oblivious to my panic. Several cars rolled on, headlights illuminating the quiet block. Normal life carried on around me, but my world felt changed. I wanted to tell someone what happened, yet I worried that nobody would believe me. They might think I had an overactive imagination or that I had misread a technical glitch. But I knew in my heart that was no ordinary electrical problem. The sequence was too precise, too purposeful. And what about the swinging playground set, or the footsteps, or that figure at the slide? Eventually, I called a friend to pick me up. As I waited for the car, I kept glancing at the park. Nothing moved in the shadows, yet it still felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to return. A single question drummed in my mind. Did something follow me out? I tried to dismiss the thought, but my instincts told me that the darkness in that park was not finished with me. When my friend arrived, I got in the car, trying to act casual. The entire ride home, my friend chatted about normal stuff, dinner plans, random gossip, weekend schedules. I barely responded. My thoughts were still in that park. Even now, as I recall the events, a part of me wonders if I imagined it all. But every time I close my eyes, I hear that click of a shutting lamp and remember the tall, silent figure by the slide. Tonight, I am tempted to return during the day, if only to prove to myself there is nothing there. But the memory of those lights going out in perfect order makes me hesitate. How could the lamps only fail one by one after I passed them? Why did the footsteps stop every time I looked back? Who or what was under that final pool of light standing so still? For now, all I can do is warn people. If you ever decide to jog there at dusk, be careful. Keep an eye on the lampposts, and if they start going dark behind you, do not hesitate. Get out while you can. The park might seem peaceful, but once it decides to watch you, it will not let you leave without a scare. The darkness there is not just nightfall, it is something else entirely, hiding among the paths, controlling the lights. Even though I am safe for the moment, I cannot help feeling that this is not over. When the sun goes down and the sky grows dark, I sometimes hear a faint electric hum outside my window. Part of me worries it could be the sound of another lamppost failing, trying to pull me back. Maybe next time the darkness will not let me leave so easily. But I refuse to let fear rule my life. If I ever find the nerve to set foot in that park again, it will be in broad daylight, when no shadows can chase me. Until then, I will remember that run as the night the lampposts led me into a world of fear, and I will remind myself some paths are better left untraveled after sunset. I remember that evening well. The sun had already dipped behind the distant hills, leaving the sky in deep shades of orange and violet. I was in a hurry to get to the other side of the lake for a family gathering. Normally, I would catch the main ferry in the late afternoon, but my bus ran behind schedule. By the time I arrived at the pier, the main boat was pulling away. The horn blasted once, and all I could do was stand there in frustration. I thought I would have to stay the night in the small town by the dock. But then I saw a single board announcing a later ferry leaving around sundown. It was the last ferry for the day, so I felt relieved. At least I would still make it across. When I boarded, I noticed the ferry was smaller than the usual daytime vessel. Its paint looked old, chipped around the edges, and the railings looked tarnished from too many seasons on the water. A single overhead light shone on the deck, casting a dull yellow glow that didn't feel very comforting. There was a low fog drifting over the lake's surface, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood and rust. Still, I told myself I was lucky to have any boat at all. Only a few other passengers were on board, 3 to be exact. One was an older couple seated quietly on a bench near the railing. They were wrapped in thick coats, holding hands, hardly speaking. The other passenger was a man wearing a hoodie, sitting away from the lamplight, leaning on a corner bench with his arms crossed. He never looked up once, just stared at the metal floor. I gave them all a polite nod before I headed inside the small passenger cabin. Just off the deck, there was a tiny enclosed area with a row of seats and windows. I planned to wait in there, protected from the fog and the chill wind, but the windows were cloudy, and the overhead light inside flickered in a way that made me uneasy. The boat's engine roared to life, and I felt a vibration under my feet. I glanced up to see a single figure in the wheelhouse, a captain wearing an old cap, both hands on the controls. I'm not sure if he saw me looking, but he nodded once. I assumed everything was normal. As the ferry pulled away from the dock, I realized the gloom of the lake was stronger than I anticipated. The fog crept around the ferry, swallowing up the view of the shore in a matter of minutes. Soon I couldn't see anything but mist on all sides. My reflection in the window seemed ghostly. Every time the ferry's light caught a swirl of fog, I felt a chill ripple along my arms. The older couple outside on the bench didn't move much, and the man in the hoodie stayed as still as a statue. The engine's steady hum became the only comfort I had. At least it told me we were making progress. But that comfort faded as the minutes rolled on. I realized we had been traveling for a while, yet it felt like we weren't getting anywhere. I could not see a shore, no hint of lights on the opposite bank. It was like we were drifting in the middle of nowhere. I decided to step outside onto the rear deck. The air had grown colder, and the fog hung thickly, making everything appear in silhouettes. I could see the older couple more clearly now. Their faces looked tense, and I noticed that the woman's lips were parted as though she was about to speak. But she never did. She only stared at the water. The man gave me a polite nod but didn't smile. I gazed up at the wheelhouse, expecting to see the captain's figure. But the small window up there was empty, no shadow at all. That was odd. Someone had to be operating the ferry. I decided maybe the captain had stepped to the side, or turned off the overhead light in his cabin. It still bothered me enough that I walked to the ladder leading up, hoping to reassure myself that everything was under control. When I climbed the short steps and peeked into the wheelhouse, my stomach twisted with sudden fear. The place was empty. The wheelhouse door stood slightly ajar. The throttle was still pushed forward, yet no one was at the helm. The ferry's engine still rumbled, but the boat seemed to be slowing. I heard water lapping against the hull in a slow pattern that hinted we were drifting more than powering forward. But there was no person in sight, certainly no captain. Disappointed and more worried than ever, I walked back out and locked the door behind me. The entire time, I wondered how we could finish our crossing without someone guiding the ferry. Returning topside, I found the older couple had moved closer to each other, whispering in low voices. The woman asked if I had found the captain. I shook my head. I tried to remain calm, but a wave of panic threatened to break through. The fog still circled the ferry, smothering us in silence. Even the gentle wave sounds seemed dulled. I looked toward the man in the hoodie, hoping he might offer some insight, but I noticed something strange. He was gone. The seat was empty now. I didn't see him go anywhere. I wondered if he had slipped into the cabin or gone around the other side of the deck. I felt an impulse to check the wheelhouse again. The boat still had a faint momentum, but it was definitely slowing. If I let this continue, we might just float aimlessly until morning. If the captain was truly gone, someone had to steer. My hands shook as I climbed back up. This time I stepped fully inside the wheelhouse. Everything was in disarray charts scattered on the floor, the radio sitting silent and turned off. I quickly flipped the switch on the radio, but it produced only static. I tried calling out a mayday or a help request, but there was no response. The thick fog might have been messing with the signal, or perhaps the radio was broken. I grasped the throttle, trying to feel some sense of control. The wheel was still, pointing straight ahead, but the ferry seemed to drift more to the left. I pushed the throttle gently, listening for a change in the engine pitch. It rumbled a bit louder, but the ferry didn't pick up speed as I had hoped. It felt like something was fighting the forward motion, like the water itself wanted to hold us in place. Suddenly, I heard an echoing thud from below, like metal hitting metal. My heart thumped. I couldn't tell if it was the engine shifting or if someone had slammed a door. Leaning out of the wheelhouse window, I shouted for the missing captain. Silence. The older couple were watching me, worry etched on their faces. Then the woman pointed toward the side of the boat, as though she saw something in the fog. I followed her gaze but saw only the swirling mist. I decided to see if I could manually steer us. I turned the wheel bit by bit, trying to point the ferry toward what I assumed was the right direction. While I did feel some slight change in angle, the boat still moved dreadfully slow, almost at a crawl. The watery haze offered no sign of banks or lights. The entire lake felt endless, as if we had been transported to another place. Minutes passed like hours. When I glanced down at the deck again, the hoodie man was back, leaning on the railing near the bow, his face hidden by the half-drawn hood. I called down, asking if he had seen the captain. He didn't answer, didn't move. A creeping sense of the unnatural gnawed at me. I felt as though I was part of some bizarre dream. Desperate, I told the older couple to join me in the wheelhouse. Maybe if we worked together, we could figure out how to control the ferry or signal for help. But the couple shook their heads, unwilling to leave their spot. They looked terrified, gripping each other's hands tightly. The woman mouthed something that might have been, "I'm sorry," as if she regretted ever stepping on this boat. I turned back to face the controls, wiping cold sweat from my forehead. The wheelhouse smelled of damp air and old cigarettes, possibly from the boat's earlier use. The captain's coat hung on a hook by the door. Had he left it behind in a hurry? Or was there something else at work, something that made him vanish so completely? As I scanned the area, I found a small control lever labeled foghorn. My mind raced. If the radio wouldn't work, maybe repeated blasts from the horn could alert someone. I gripped the lever and pulled it. A long, deep call echoed across the lake, reverberating in the mist like a mournful wail. I waited, heart pounding, hoping to hear a distant reply or see a light from a rescue boat. But nothing returned, just the horn's echo fading slowly into the thick fog. Frustration boiled inside me. I kept pulling the lever, blasting the horn again and again. With each note, I felt my chest tighten. If we received no answer, we risked floating until we ran out of fuel or drifted off course entirely. The ridiculous part was the ferry was still running, the engine had not died, yet it felt as though an invisible hand was holding us in place. Then something made me jump. A voice crackled through the radio. It was faint, full of static, but I heard a couple of words. "Hello. Heck." The signal died. I grabbed the radio, pressing the transmit button and yelling for help, explaining we had lost the captain. My voice echoed in the narrow wheelhouse, but the only response was a burst of static. Then the light overhead flickered, and I felt a subtle shift under my feet. We were moving again. Some new force sped us up just slightly. The motion was not coming from my handling of the throttle. It felt external, like a current or wave had seized us. I tried to keep the wheel steady. For a brief moment I imagined we had broken free of whatever had held us. My heart lifted, expecting to see the shoreline appear through the fog. But no land emerged, just an endless curtain of gray around us. A door slammed below deck, loud as a gunshot in the emptiness. My thoughts raced. Could the captain be down there, trying to get our attention? I left the wheelhouse, bounding down the ladder 2 steps at a time, almost slipping on the wet metal. Once on the main deck, I looked around. The older couple stared at me, eyes wide. The hooded man was still at the bow, unmoving. I found the same corridor leading below, the same half-open door. It swung slightly in the breeze as if someone had passed through it. I hurried inside, calling out. The flickering lights gave everything a jittery glow, making shadows dance on the walls. Down the hallway, I reached the locked bulkhead door. It was closed, locked from the outside. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pressed my ear against the metal, listening for any sound. There was just the hum of the engine, no voices, no footsteps. Backing away, I realized my efforts felt pointless. If someone or something lurked behind that door, they were not responding. Maybe the best thing to do was to find that man in the hoodie and talk to him. He was the only one who had disappeared briefly and come back. Perhaps he knew something. I returned to the deck, scanning the bow. The fog parted slightly, revealing the rails. He was gone again. Puzzled, I circled around to the other side of the ferry. That's when I saw him. He was standing near the older couple now, speaking quietly to them. I approached carefully. As I neared, the couple looked at me with a startled expression, as though I had interrupted something private. The hooded man turned partially, but I couldn't get a clear look at his face. I took a deep breath and asked if they had any idea where the captain was or how to steer the ferry. The hooded man just shook his head slowly. His voice, when he answered, was low and cold. "We're nearly there." My skin prickled at his tone. Nearly where? We were in the middle of a fog-shrouded lake. The older couple clasped each other's hands more tightly, and I noticed tears in the woman's eyes. A sense of dread formed in my stomach. Suddenly the engine roared, the boat gave a lurch, and we started moving faster. I staggered, grabbing the railing for balance. Those of us on deck exchanged nervous glances. Without anyone at the helm, the ferry seemed to be powering forward on its own. I ran up again to the wheelhouse, but the throttle was stuck in place, the same as I'd left it, nowhere near full power. Yet something was driving us onward. The boat cut through the fog, and a shiver of fear ran through me as I realized we had no idea what lay ahead. A shape appeared in the distance, some dark outline on the water. Gradually it grew bigger, like a shadowy form of land or a large rock. But there were no normal lights, no welcoming harbor beacons. The ferry glided straight toward it, unstoppable. I realized that if we weren't careful, we might crash. I grabbed the wheel, trying to turn us away, but the wheel refused to budge. It was as if it had locked up. Meanwhile, the older couple trembled by the rail, and I heard them praying softly. The hooded man stood behind them, silent. I shouted a warning, telling them to hold on to something. The black shape on the water grew clearer. It looked like a small rocky isle or a ruined dock. The ferry slowed again, gliding in. Water lapped against crumbled stone. A broken sign jutted from the water's edge, unreadable in the gloom. We bumped gently against the remains of the dock, but the ferry didn't fully stop. It idled there, as though expecting us to leave. The older couple looked at me, fear plain on their faces. None of us wanted to disembark onto that eerie land. Yet the sense of compulsion was strong. You could feel it in the air, some invisible pull. The hooded man moved first, stepping off the ferry in one smooth motion. He paused on the crumbling stone, turning back to face us. Even in that moment, his face was hidden by shadow. The older couple followed him, as if entranced. I called out for them to stay, telling them we should stick together on the boat until we found the real shore. But they did not listen. They walked behind the hooded man, disappearing into the fog. I was alone, the ferry gently rocking against the dock. Then, as quietly as it had arrived, the engine revved. The boat pulled back, away from the broken stones. Like a self-guided machine, it drifted into the open fog. I realized I hadn't moved from the wheelhouse walkway. Staring back at the crumbled dock, I saw only swirling mist. The captain was gone. Those 3 passengers were gone. I had not made it to my original destination, far from it. Now I stand alone on this ferry, listening to the hum of its engine as it carries me who knows where. The fog remains thick, the horizon empty. Part of me wants to leap overboard and swim, but I suspect it's already too late. The ferry moves at its own will, or perhaps the will of something else that claimed our captain and lured those passengers away. The worst part is that the ferry never stops. It just keeps gliding across the endless water, occasionally slowing, sometimes skimming near some ghostly shore that never quite comes into view. I keep blowing the foghorn, hoping to attract a living soul. My voice on the radio goes unanswered. My only company is the steady throb of the engine, and the fear that I too will vanish if I let my guard down. I write this now on a scrap of paper I found in the wheelhouse, hoping someone might discover it if the ferry ever docks again. Day and night blend together in the mist, and I have lost track of the time. All I know is that the small overhead lamp still burns, the engine still runs, and I stay afraid of what I might find if I dare step below deck again. Wherever this ferry is heading, I suspect it leads to a place beyond any normal map. If you ever see a small, worn ferry emerging from a foggy lake, be wary. Someone might wave from the deck, or a sign might tempt you to board for a last late crossing. But learn from my mistake. Do not step aboard. Once the ferry claims you, it may never let you leave in the same way you arrived. I work in a large office building that looks like concrete on the outside. It is not the fanciest place to spend your days, but it pays the bills. Inside, on the ground floor, there is a small courtyard enclosed by 4 walls of glass. Most of my colleagues ignore it because it has no special decoration, just a few leftover flower pots, some flat stones, and a single bench. The company never bothered to fix it up or turn it into a garden area. Over the years, it became a forgotten space nobody ever visits. When I started my job about 2 months ago, I was curious about that courtyard. It was always locked, and the glass door leading to it had a sign that read, "No entry." I would sometimes stand by the glass, looking in. The place felt silent and neglected. A few weeds poked through the cracks in the concrete floor, and faint green moss clung to the corners. I wondered if maybe, long ago, employees used it as a break area. But from what I heard, it had been closed off for a very long time, likely because it cost too much to maintain. One day I was finishing my tasks late. The sun was going down, and I felt the usual hush in the building after most people left. Only a few lights remained on in the corridors. I stopped to get a drink of water near the glass door that overlooked the courtyard. It was nearly dusk, that moment when the sky transitions from orange to a soft purple. As I drank, I glanced at the courtyard. At first, I saw only the bench and the scattered pots. Then, I noticed a shape standing by the far wall. I almost choked on my water. A person was in the courtyard. They seemed tall and wore dark clothing. The figure stood completely still, back turned toward me, like an old statue. 1,000 questions jumped into my head. How did this person get access to that locked courtyard? Were they a coworker with a key, or maybe someone from maintenance? But the figure was so motionless, it felt unsettling. I leaned closer to the glass door, trying to see more detail. Even though the courtyard was only dimly lit from the office hallway lights, I could see that the person had short, dark hair, or maybe a hood. Ever so slowly, I lifted a hand to tap on the glass. My heart beat faster for no clear reason. Something about that still posture made me uneasy. Before I tapped, I hesitated. The figure remained in place, as if it was not aware of me at all. I decided to check if I could open the glass door. Most days it was locked, but maybe it was accidentally left open this time. My hand touched the handle, and sure enough, it failed to budge. It was locked, like usual. I called out quietly, "Hello? Can you hear me?" My voice sounded weak against the thick glass. The figure did not respond or move. The strange fear inside me grew. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I considered getting someone else to see. But the office was almost empty, and I was not even sure which coworker was still around. I thought of calling security, but that felt like an overreaction. Maybe it was just a janitor out there. Maybe they came through some other entrance. I shook my head, feeling foolish for getting spooked. I decided to finish my work and see if the person left on their own. I hurried back to my desk on the second floor, though I caught myself glancing over my shoulder as I stepped away from the courtyard door. The hall felt strangely silent, and even my footsteps sounded too loud. I got back to my computer and tried to focus on the final reports I had to complete, but my mind kept drifting back to that unmoving figure. Who stands so still as dusk settles? 20 minutes later, I realized I had forgotten to email a file. Frustrated with myself, I typed quickly, finishing my tasks. By the time I was done, the office was nearly pitch black outside the few emergency lights. I gathered my things, double-checked the time, nearly 8 p.m. Usually I left earlier. My plan was to head out immediately, maybe pick up dinner on the way. Yet I felt an odd urge to look at the courtyard one more time. I needed to confirm that the person had gone, or see if I needed to call someone. So I walked back downstairs, my shoes making soft echoes in the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale, harsh glow. At the end of the hallway, right where the glass door stood, I noticed something unusual. The door was completely dark. When I got closer, I realized the overhead light in that corridor had burned out, leaving the glass area in shadow. I paused, letting my eyes adjust. The glass door reflected a bit of the corridor behind me, but I could still peek through. The courtyard was darker than before. The night sky above it now a deep blue fading to black. At first glance, I didn't see anyone out there. My initial thought was relief. The figure must have left. Then I noticed footprints on the courtyard floor. Muddy tracks, faint but visible even in the low light. They started near where the figure had been standing and moved in a line toward the corner of the courtyard, where a small drain was located. My breath caught in my throat. If these footprints belonged to the person, why had they walked to that corner? I peered through the glass, straining to see, but the darkness made it impossible to spot more details. A wave of unease washed over me. The emptiness of the courtyard now felt more ominous than seeing someone inside it. The locked door remained locked, yet there were fresh footprints in the mud. Even if the figure had a key, it did not explain the silent, statue-like stance. And if they had left, why not exit through the door that led to my hallway? Though I felt unsettled, I decided to go home and return in the morning with a clear head. Maybe the footprints belonged to a maintenance worker. Maybe they had a reason to stand there, checking something in the wall. Trying to reassure myself, I hurried out of the office, flicking off the lights as I went. The entire ride home, I could not shake the image of that silent, dark figure. That night, as I tried to sleep, my mind replayed the scene. The posture, the weight of that moment. It filled me with a strange dread, like the figure was not quite human. I knew this was ridiculous. It had to be a person, obviously. We live in a real world, not a ghost story. Still, logic did not help my nervousness. In the morning, I arrived at work a bit earlier than usual. The courtyard door was now illuminated by the replaced light bulb overhead, and I felt a slight sense of relief at the normal brightness. I approached the door again, peering in to see if the muddy footprints remained. They did, but they had dried in the early sun, leaving a messy trail of crusted dirt. Surprising me further, the footprints no longer led to the corner. They seemed to curve around the bench and vanish behind a patch of weeds. It was as though someone had smudged them or added more. Confusion flickered through me. I went to find our building maintenance person, Mr. Reynolds, to ask if he had been in the courtyard recently or if he gave anyone else a key. Mr. Reynolds was a friendly older man who took care of small repairs. He looked at me with raised eyebrows when I mentioned the footprints. He insisted that he had not entered that courtyard in months. The company had discontinued upkeep, so there was no reason for him to be there. I asked if there was any other access to the courtyard. He shrugged and moved over to a set of old building plans pinned to a board. According to his map, there was no other door, just the glass door from the hallway. Unless someone climbed a ladder to the roof or scaled the walls from outside, getting in or out would be difficult. Reynolds even joked that maybe I saw a ghost. I did not laugh. His words gave me a chill. Over lunch, I told one of my co-workers, Nina, about what I had seen. She gave me a curious look. Strange. I've been here for a year, and I don't think I've ever even glanced at that courtyard. If you want, let's both check it out after work. Part of me wanted to say no, to just let it go. But another part needed answers. We agreed to meet near the glass door before leaving the office that evening. Work went by slowly, my mind never drifting too far from the locked courtyard. Every now and then, I would catch myself looking at the clock, counting the hours until I could investigate further. At exactly 5:30 p.m., I gathered my things and headed downstairs. Nina was already waiting there with her coat on, scanning the courtyard through the glass. "Look at those footprints," she murmured when she saw me arrive. "They're definitely from a person, but the pattern looks weird." We pressed our faces to the glass door, analyzing the tracks. They formed a scattered line near the bench, then turned sharply toward the corner, the same corner I saw the figure facing. The footprints were more prominent now, as if someone had reinforced them with fresh mud, yet the ground outside was dry. No sign of recent rain. Nina tried the door. It refused to budge. She tapped the glass lightly, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Her voice echoed in the small courtyard. No answer. Everything was silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning from inside the office. "Maybe we should ask the security guard to unlock it," I suggested. The guard, a part-time employee, kept a set of keys. If the courtyard was truly restricted, he might not open it for us. But it was worth a shot. We walked to the front desk, found him reading a magazine. When we asked to look inside the courtyard, he was surprised. He gave us a key ring, saying, "I think it's this silver one. Just don't break anything." Returning to the door, we carefully unlocked it. The door slid open with a reluctant creak. A musty smell greeted us, combined with a hint of damp earth. The air felt colder than the hallway, which struck me as strange because it was still fairly warm outside. We stepped into the courtyard, the sound of our shoes on the concrete echoing softly. The footprints led left toward the bench, so we followed them. I felt my pulse quicken. Nina stayed close to me, her eyes scanning every shadow. The bench itself was covered in a thin layer of dust, and a few small leaves had fallen onto it from an overhead vent. There were no footprints on the bench seat, no sign that anyone recently sat there. I touched the wood, expecting it to feel damp. It was dry. We continued on, tracing the muddy prints as they curled around the bench and moved toward the far wall. The final footprint stopped just inches from the brick. On the wall's surface, we saw faint scratches like claw marks, forming strange vertical lines. Nina and I exchanged uneasy looks. The lines were not deep, but something about their pattern felt deliberate. "You think someone was trying to get out this way?" Nina asked quietly. She reached out and brushed her fingers over the brick. It was solid, with no hidden door or window. Below the scratches, the ground was slightly wet. A stall drain at the base of the wall seemed clogged with leaves, which might have caused some puddling. That could explain the mud, but it did not explain why these footprints ended here, or why anyone would scratch the wall. I stepped back, scanning the courtyard from yet another angle. Then I noticed something new. On the far corner, near some old flower pots, there was a shallow pile of leaves, and among them a set of footprints that seemed to face us, as though the figure once stood there looking in our direction. The hair on my arms rose. Could it be the same figure I saw at dusk? Nina must have sensed my unease because she whispered, "There's no breeze here. How did leaves pile up like that?" Neither of us had an answer. The courtyard felt stifling now, the air too dense, and the silence unnerved me. The building's normal hum was still there, but it felt distant. It was as if we had stepped into a different pocket of reality, cut off from the regular office environment. We heard a sudden clang from above. Our hearts leaped. We looked up, only to see a metal gutter running across the rooftop. Maybe a loose piece of debris fell inside it. We waited, but no more sounds followed. The silence returned, heavier than before. "Okay," Nina said, exhaling. "I've seen enough. This is too creepy." I agreed wholeheartedly. There was nothing more for us to do but lock the courtyard again. We left the footprints undisturbed, except for our own shoe marks. Before stepping back inside, I gave one final look at the corner with the scratches. A strange sense of being watched clung to me. We relocked the glass door and returned the keys to the security guard. He asked if we found anything interesting. We lied, saying we only saw some abandoned junk and left. Neither of us wanted to explain the footprints or the scratches. After all, who would believe something so odd? We parted ways in the lobby and I headed home. My head swirled with images of the courtyard, the silent figure, and those footprints that ended at a blank wall. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept imagining footsteps echoing in empty hallways or the glare of someone's eyes watching me. Once, I jumped out of bed, thinking I heard a knock on my door, but it was only the wind outside. The next morning, I spoke with Nina again. She told me she had been thinking about the courtyard too, uneasy about the figure I saw. She suggested we move on and ignore it. We have jobs to do, and maybe it's best we let the management handle it. She was right, of course, but I still felt a deep curiosity. Despite my fear, I wanted answers. As for now, the courtyard remains locked. The footprints may still be there unless the maintenance staff finally cleans the place. Part of me dreads that the figure might return, standing motionless in that forgotten space, only to vanish by nightfall. Another part of me wonders if it ever truly left, or if it is trapped, moving through some hidden path we cannot see. I do my best to work without staring at the courtyard door, but sometimes near dusk I sense a faint presence just out of sight. I wonder if something stands in the dim light, observing us through the glass. The thought sends shivers through me, yet I cannot prove anything. All I know is that one evening I saw a figure out there, and by the time darkness fell, it vanished, leaving only muddy footprints and that unsettling reminder. Some places are empty for a reason. We arrived at the mountain retreat with high hopes for a peaceful family vacation. My parents had saved up for months to rent a cabin by the lake, away from the busy city. My younger sister Ava jumped out of the car first, excited to breathe in the crisp mountain air. My dad went to the small office to pick up the keys, while my mom admired the tall pines and thick bushes lining the gravel path. I felt a tingle of excitement, too. There is something refreshing about the smell of pine needles and the sound of birds hidden in the trees. But part of me also felt an odd sense of unease, though I told myself it was just the long road trip messing with my mood. After a few minutes, my dad came back, shaking his head a little. "They gave us cabin 13, he said, with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My sister laughed and said that 13 was unlucky. My mom quickly brushed off the superstition, saying that life was full of random numbers, and we should not worry about a simple label. Still, my dad looked a bit concerned. I told him it was nothing, just a number. We grabbed our bags and headed down a narrow dirt trail to find our place. Cabin 13 looked cozy enough from the outside. It had a small porch with 2 chairs and a wooden swing. A few wildflowers grew near the steps, and an old lantern hung by the front door. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. As I walked up the steps, I noticed a slight chill in the air, colder than it had been at the parking area. Maybe it was just the sun dipping behind the tall pines. I shrugged my shoulders and followed my parents inside. The interior was rustic, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and creaking furniture. There were 2 bedrooms separated by a small hallway, and a living area that connected to a tiny kitchen. My sister called dibs on the smaller bedroom, so I took the sofa bed in the living room. My parents took the bigger bedroom. Once we turned on the lights, I realized the cabin felt dim, as though the wood walls absorbed too much light. I also noticed one corner by the fireplace felt much colder than the rest of the room. Dad said it was likely just a draft. He pulled out an old blanket and stuffed it near the gap in the logs, hoping it would block cold air. That night, we decided to start the vacation with a simple meal of grilled sandwiches. The kitchen smelled of melted cheese and toast, which boosted our moods. We ate together, chatting about plans to go hiking and fishing. My sister wanted to see if we could rent canoes on the lake. My mom suggested we might also do an evening campfire, roast marshmallows, and share stories. With full stomachs, we all felt more relaxed, even if the wind outside was picking up. Around 9 p.m., my parents announced they were turning in early. The long drive had left them exhausted. My sister quickly followed, eager to curl up in her new bedroom. That left me alone in the living room, the only source of light coming from a single floor lamp near the couch. I flipped through channels on the old TV, but nothing interesting was on. Eventually, I turned it off to enjoy the silence of the mountains. That was when I first heard a strange tapping sound, like small fingers knocking on wood. I turned my head, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Maybe tree branches were scraping the cabin's outer walls. The wind had grown stronger after all. A minute later the tapping stopped, replaced by a sudden gust that rattled the windows. A chill crept over me. I realized the cold corner by the fireplace seemed even colder now, as if someone had opened an invisible freezer door. I got up to check the blanket Dad had stuffed in the crack. It was still there, but the air was definitely chilly at that spot. I rubbed my arms, feeling goosebumps. Then I heard a light thump on the porch, like a footstep. My heart skipped a beat. I peeked through a small window, but all I saw was darkness and a slice of moonlight reflecting off the porch railing. Convinced it was my imagination, I returned to the sofa, wrapped myself in a blanket, and told myself to get some sleep. The night passed fitfully. The cabin seemed to shift and creak, and cold drafts touched me every time I started to drift off. At one point I thought I saw a slim shape move outside the main window, a faint figure drifting by in the moonlight. My eyes snapped open and I leaned forward, but there was nothing but the dim outline of pine trees. It took me a long time to fall into a restless sleep. In the morning, the cabin felt brighter and more cheerful. Sunshine poured through the windows, turning the walls a warm shade of gold. My sister bounded out of her room ready to hike. My parents asked if I slept well, and I shrugged, saying I must not be used to the sounds of nature. I decided not to mention the tapping or the figure at the window. After breakfast, we packed some sandwiches, water bottles, and headed out for a day on the trails. The mountains were stunning. Tall pines and large boulders lined the winding paths. We walked for hours, breathing in the fresh scent of moss and listening to birds call across the valley. The sky was a bright blue, and the sunlight through the trees felt gentle on our faces. Tired but happy, we returned to the cabin in the late afternoon. My mom said, "This place looks less spooky during the day," and we all laughed. Still, whenever I stepped inside, I felt that same chill in the corner by the fireplace. My dad decided to investigate more, checking the outside wall. He didn't find any cracks large enough to cause such a distinct cold spot. He banged on the logs, listened for hollow sounds, and found nothing. He left it at that, saying we would just make sure to keep the fireplace going at night. If it was a little drafty, so be it. We gathered firewood from the nearby pile and built a warm fire that crackled and lit the room with a comforting glow. That evening we played board games on the small wooden table. My sister teased me for jumping whenever a log snapped in the flames. I teased her back about snoring too loudly. The laughter made the cabin feel cozy for a while, but once the clock struck 10, a heavy hush settled in the air. My sister yawned and said she was going to bed. My dad soon followed, saying he wanted to take an early morning walk by the lake. My mom lingered, watching the embers fade in the fireplace. Eventually, she gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder, told me not to stay up too late, and disappeared into their bedroom. I felt the cold spot extend slowly across the floor. The fire was dying, but it shouldn't have cooled the room that fast. My skin tingled with unease. Determined not to get spooked, I stoked the fire a bit more, adding another log. Warm flames licked up again, but the strange chill remained. Then a soft scraping sound came from the front porch. My body froze. The memory of the tapping from the previous night rushed back. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked to the door and cracked it open just enough to peer outside. A cold breeze slipped in, causing me to shiver. The porch lay empty, save for 2 simple chairs, gently rocking in the wind. I saw nothing unusual. No footprints, no strange figures, only the moonlit yard and the dark silhouettes of towering pines. The wind rustled the branches, and I thought I caught a flicker of movement near the tree line, but the shadows made it hard to see. I shut the door quickly, feeling my heartbeat pound in my chest. When I turned around, I noticed a shift in the shadows inside the cabin. Standing near the living room window was a faint outline, almost transparent, like a curtain of smoke in a human shape. My blood ran cold. For a moment I could not breathe. The figure seemed to hover or drift rather than stand. It had no clear features, but I sensed it was looking straight at me. I gasped in shock, dropping the flashlight. It clattered on the wooden floor, the beam swinging wildly around the room. By the time I managed to pick it up and shine it toward the window, the figure was gone. Only the quivering tail of something smoky seemed to vanish through the glass. I stood there, heart pounding, mind racing. My first instinct was to wake my parents, but I knew they would just think I was imagining things. Or worse, they would think I was overreacting. Deciding I needed proof, I rushed outside, hoping to catch a real glimpse of the figure. But the porch was empty, the yard silent. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the ground. I searched the grass and the nearby dirt for footprints. Nothing. The only track I found was a swirl of disturbed leaves by the window. It was as if a gust of wind had passed there recently. Shivering, I returned indoors, locked the door, and sat by the fire for what felt like an hour before my nerves settled enough to let me fall asleep on the sofa. The next morning at breakfast, I quietly mentioned that I thought I saw someone outside. My dad frowned, thinking maybe a trespasser came by. My mom suggested it was just the wind. My sister teased me that it might be the cabin's ghost if there was one. I did not have the energy to laugh. The whole day, a sense of dread stayed with me. We did our family activities as planned: a canoe ride on the lake, a simple picnic by the shore, and a visit to a nearby lookout point. My parents seemed pleased with the beautiful mountain scenery. My sister was excited to take photos of wildlife. Meanwhile, I felt my mind wander, remembering that cold corner by the fireplace and the figure that drifted away from the window. Part of me wanted to leave the cabin early, but I was afraid to spoil the vacation for everyone else. When we returned in the afternoon, I approached the manager's office. A thin woman greeted me with a cheerful smile, asking if I needed something. Feeling a bit awkward, I asked if anything unusual had happened with Cabin 13 before. She gave me a puzzled smile and said she wasn't aware of any problems, aside from the usual mountain critters wandering around. Maybe it was just an older building with drafts. I thanked her and left, not satisfied but unable to press the topic further without sounding paranoid. Our final night arrived, and I felt a growing sense of unease. My parents decided to have a small barbecue on the porch. We grilled hot dogs and shared jokes, everyone in a pleasant mood. The cold breeze came and went, but the moment felt too nice for me to mention my worries again. As darkness fell, we retreated inside, stashing away leftovers in the tiny kitchen. My sister and parents turned in around 10, as usual, leaving me once more in the living room. I added several logs to the fireplace, hoping the bright fire would chase away any dreadful sensation. For a while, it worked. I read a book under the lamp, feeling almost comfortable. Almost. Then the cold corner pressed in again. I saw the flames weaken, as if a sudden gust of wind had passed through the chimney. Goosebumps formed on my arms. A glow caught my attention by the window. I looked up, and for the second time, I saw that faint figure gliding past. This time, it was closer. Shaped like a tall person, but without distinct features. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as though it was searching for something. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to stand up. I needed a clearer look. The figure paused at the window, almost as if it sensed me watching. The glass fogged in an instant, creating a thin layer of condensation. Then, as quickly as it formed, the fog cleared, and I caught a glimpse of the figure's face. It was pale, hollow, and had two dark hollows where eyes should be. I gasped, stumbling back onto the couch. The figure continued drifting, disappearing around the side of the cabin. Summoning courage, I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight, determined to find out what was happening. I dashed outside. The air felt colder than it had all week, biting into my cheeks. I spotted fresh footprints in the dirt, oddly shaped, not exactly human-looking, more like smears. I followed them around the corner of the cabin, my flashlight revealing twisted tree roots and scattered pine needles. The footprints ended where a large rock protruded from the ground. Beyond that, damp leaves and darkness offered me no clues. Frustrated and uneasy, I returned inside to see the cold spot by the fireplace had vanished. The whole cabin felt normal again, just slightly chilly from the outside air. My parents and sister slept on, unaware of the visitor who roamed near our window. I stayed awake until almost dawn, half expecting another noise or chill. But the hours passed quietly. We checked out the next morning. My dad joked about the drafty corner, saying we could have used a heater. My mom teased me that city life had made me sensitive to mountain nights. Deep down, though, I knew what I saw. Or at least I believed I had seen something real. The memory of that hollow face lingers with me even now. Driving away, I glanced back at cabin 13. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the window, watching us leave. Then the car turned a bend, and the cabin disappeared behind pine trees. I cannot say for sure what haunted that corner or why it felt so cold at night. But I know the mountains hold many old secrets, and maybe that lonely spirit simply wandered there, finding no rest. If you ever find yourself at those rustic cabins, watch out for the chill in the air. You may find that something beyond our world drifts through the night, searching for warmth it can never truly feel. I took the job because I needed extra cash. The listing said, night security guard wanted for closed factory. It did not look too difficult. I assumed I would watch a few security cameras, walk around once or twice, then spend the rest of the shift scrolling on my phone. The pay was decent, and the manager who interviewed me said I would mostly be alone, as the factory stopped production a year ago. A skeleton crew came in the daytime to handle maintenance. But overnight it was just me and miles of hollow corridors filled with silent machinery. I told myself it would be easy. I packed a thermos of coffee and reported for my first night at exactly 10 p.m. When I arrived, I met the day guard, a tired-looking older man named Ronnie. He nodded at me and gave a quick briefing. Make your rounds once every 2 hours, check all the locked doors, sign the logbook, and if the alarm goes off, call the emergency number. He pointed to a dusty phone on a wall next to the security desk. Then he looked at me with an odd frown. You got a flashlight? I nodded, showing him my brand new one. He grunted in approval, then said under his breath, Well, good luck. Before I could ask him more, he grabbed his jacket and left in a hurry. I found myself alone in the security office, which was just a small room at the front of the building, holding a desk, a few monitors, and a single dim lamp. The factory's lights were powered down in most areas since production had ceased. Only emergency lights glowed here and there, giving the corridors a faint orange hue. I clicked through the camera feeds, seeing mostly static images of empty halls, dusty equipment, and big steel doors. The quiet became strangely loud. Every tap of my pen against the desk felt sharp, amplified by the emptiness surrounding me. At midnight, I decided to begin my first round. The manager had left a map of the building on the desk. The place was huge. Various assembly lines, a shipping area, and 2 massive warehouse wings. I zipped up my jacket, turned on my flashlight, and stepped out into the main corridor. Right away, I noticed how cold it felt. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust. My footsteps echoed off the metal walls, reminding me of how alone I was. I passed row after row of machinery, once used to churn out products day and night. Now they stood silent, half covered in plastic sheets. The floors were mostly clean, though dust gathered in corners. Every so often I saw a lamp flicker above me, the old bulbs nearly worn out. As I walked deeper, the corridor branched. Following my map, I took a left toward the main assembly line to check the big overhead doors, just as the instructions said. The assembly line area was a wide open space filled with tall machines on either side, like towers in a canyon. Conveyors snaked across the floor, connecting different sections. My flashlight beam skittered over silent gears and rollers. The hush was eerie, broken only by the faint buzz of a far-off light. I walked slowly, scanning everything, my breath forming small clouds in the cool air. Then, in the distance, I heard a faint hum. My heart pounded as I followed the sound. That was when I noticed a lone conveyor belt on the far side, near a big loading gate. It moved slowly as if someone had flipped the switch, but all factory power was supposed to be off for the night, except for the emergency lights. I stared, uncertain if my eyes were playing tricks. Yet the belt kept rolling, squeaking gently at its joints. A shape rested on it, a small cardboard box that inched closer to the end of the conveyor. The overhead lamps around that station were out, so I had to rely on my flashlight. I approached carefully, shining the beam onto the control panel. The indicator lights were dark, the power switch in the off position. No hum of electricity, no sign it should be running, but the belt definitely shifted along its track, carrying that little box. As it reached the end, the box tumbled off, landing with a soft thud against the floor. Then, just as slowly, the conveyor belt stopped, like it had never moved at all. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I whispered, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed back. I waited, shining my flashlight into the corners. It was empty. The only door to this area was locked from the inside, and I still held the only key. With trembling hands, I picked up the small cardboard box. It was sealed, no markings or labels. Feeling uneasy, I set it aside on a nearby shelf. Maybe there was a short circuit. I made a mental note to tell Ronnie or the manager in the morning. Heart pounding, I hurried back to the corridor, wanting to finish my patrol quickly. I forced myself to remain calm. Factories could be spooky at night, and I might be overreacting. Something mechanical must have triggered that conveyor, I told myself. No reason to panic. But in the back of my mind, the question remained. Why would just one belt run for a moment, then stop? I tried to shake the thought away, continuing through the warehouse wings. Everything else seemed normal, just silent aisles of stored crates, their shapes looming tall in the dim emergency lighting. By the time I returned to the security office, it was almost 1 a.m. My nerves settled once I was back in a lit room with the monitors. I poured some coffee from my thermos, the warmth comforting. I scanned the cameras, seeing no movement. The factory was quiet again. Yet I felt uneasy, as if something watched me through the screens. Each dusty corridor looked nearly the same, but one camera feed flickered for a moment. I recognized it as the assembly line area. My chest tightened. Nothing else happened, though, so I tried to assure myself it was just old wiring. At 2 a.m., it was time for another round. I did not want to head back toward that conveyor belt, but my route required me to check all major points. So I walked again through the long corridors, checking doors, scribbling notes in my log. Everything seemed in order. As I approached the assembly area, I felt a cold draft. The hair on my arms stood up. A metal clang echoed through the hall. I froze, shining my flashlight down the length of the floor. Something moved at the edge of my vision, a faint shape darting behind a machine. My heart thumped like a drum in my ears. I forced my feet to move forward, shining the beam across the battered conveyor belts. The one from before sat still, no sign of motion. In fact, I noticed the small box I had placed on the shelf was gone. The shelf stood empty, coated in dust. My eyes scanned the ground, but I did not see it. Taking a deep breath, I called out, "Is anyone here? This is security." My voice echoed among the silent machines. No response. The shape I saw had vanished. With shaking steps, I circled around the conveyor, trying to see if maybe a cat or a raccoon had sneaked in. The large overhead door was locked, the padlock still in place. No sign of forced entry. Another clang sounded behind me. I spun around just in time to see a metal rod roll off a nearby workstation. It clattered onto the floor, sending sharp echoes bouncing off the walls. But no one was there to push it. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. Fear gnawed at my mind, but this was my job. The building was locked, and nobody else was supposed to be inside. Something was not right, though. My instincts told me to be careful. I finished the rest of my round at a faster pace, occasionally looking over my shoulder. Shadows played tricks on me, forming strange shapes among the machines. I began to dread each corner I turned. By the time I got back to the office, my uniform was damp with sweat. For the next hour, I kept my eyes glued to the camera feeds. I tried to spot any movement, but the images remained still. Shadows, metal beams, stacked crates. No living thing in sight. Around 3:30 a.m., a faint scraping noise reached me from somewhere outside the office door. My heart jumped. I checked the hallway camera. Still images only. I grabbed my flashlight and eased the door open. The corridor was empty. I forced myself to walk a few steps, shining the beam around. Nothing, but I heard faint scuffling overhead, as though something crawled in the ventilation. I retreated back to the security desk, deciding not to chase random noises through a massive dark factory. I inhaled deeply, telling myself plenty of old buildings have weird vibes. Maybe an animal got inside. That was more likely than any other explanation. Even so, a part of me could not forget the quiet movement of the conveyor belt and the missing box. At 4 a.m., I had to do the final big round of the night. The building was huge, and if I tried to skip it, the manager would wonder why I did not log everything. So, with my heart beating faster than normal, I ventured out again. The corridors that had seemed lonely before now felt menacing, with long shadows that stretched like claws across the floors. Every now and then, a distant clang or rattle made me jump. I saved the assembly line for last, hoping to rush through it. When I reached that section, the overhead lights flickered. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself forward. Rows of silent machines loomed on each side. The belts lay still, collecting dust. Then, to my horror, I saw the same conveyor from before sputter to life. It squeaked and rattled, moving as if it carried a heavy load. But there was nothing on it. I aimed my flashlight at the control panel again, noticing it remained off. No glowing indicators, no reason for it to run. The belt jerked, sped up a little, then halted with a harsh squeal. Everything went silent. My heart hammered. Suddenly a loud bang echoed from behind me. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. A door in the corner marked storage had slammed shut. I rushed to it, shining my beam on the handle. It was locked. I tried rattling it, calling out, "Security! Who's in there?" No answer, just the muffled hum of machinery that no longer worked and the lingering echo of that bang. My instincts screamed to turn around and run, yet I found myself drawn to the door. I fumbled for my keys, trying to recall if I even had one that fit the storage room. The manager had only given me keys for certain doors, and this did not seem to be one of them. Then, as I crouched by the door, a soft voice emerged from behind the steel. It sounded like a whisper, but I could not make out the words. My heart thudded so loudly, I worried I was imagining it. I pressed my ear to the cold metal. The voice stopped. A second later, the metal jerked under my touch, as if someone had kicked it from inside. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. That was enough. I sprinted back to the security office, ignoring the shrill echo of my own footsteps. Once there, I locked the door behind me, breathing heavily. I grabbed the phone on the wall and dialed the emergency contact number Ronnie had left. It rang and rang, no answer. I tried the manager's number, straight to voicemail. Feeling trapped, I frantically switched through the camera feeds, hoping to see something that would give me a rational explanation. Then I noticed one feed of view near the storage room flicker wildly. For a moment I caught sight of a blurry outline crossing the hallway. It was shaped like a person, but tall and strangely distorted, as though hunched. The figure paused at the door, the storage door I had just fled from. The camera feed jumped, replaced by static, then cleared a second later. The hallway was empty. My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped the phone. I could not stay here until dawn, not with something roaming the halls. Pulling myself together, I stepped into the corridor and made for the exit. That required passing the shipping bay near the assembly line. The hush swallowed me as I moved. As I neared the conveyor belt again, I saw something new. The small cardboard box lay in the middle of the floor, open. I did not dare stop to look inside. My eyes locked on the exit door at the back. It led outside to the loading dock. which I knew connected to the parking lot by a side path. I prayed the door was not chained. Luckily, the push bar gave way. I burst out into the crisp night air, nearly tripping on the raised concrete lip. The factory's yard was empty under pale stars, a light breeze rustling scraps of paper. I hurried around the building to my car, not bothering to clock out. When I started the engine, I realized I was shaking so badly that I could barely grip the wheel. Without a backward glance, I sped away, the towering silhouette of the factory shrinking behind me. Early the next morning, the manager called me, sounding annoyed that I left my shift early. I told him I heard strange noises and saw someone inside. He insisted the building was locked, that no one else could possibly be there. I did not argue. I just said I was done with the job. Whatever roams that factory at night can stay there, haunting those dusty halls and occasionally making a conveyor belt move with no power. To this day, I cannot fully explain what I experienced. Perhaps an intruder managed to hide inside, or some odd mechanical glitch caused the strange occurrences. But deep down, I suspect there was something else in that old factory. A presence that lingers in the quiet spaces, activating dead machinery when no one else is looking. I can still picture that belt turning in the darkness, the squeak of rollers echoing off silent machines. And I remember the voice behind the storage door, a voice I hope never to hear again. If you ever consider a night shift in a long abandoned place, be certain you are ready for what might remain there, waiting in the shadows when the lights go out. I was sitting at my small desk, books and notes scattered all around me, trying my best to stay awake. It was well past midnight, and my study lamp was the only light glowing in the entire dorm room. Outside, the old campus oak tree swayed gently in the wind. I could hear a few leaves brushing against the brick wall, creating a soft rustling noise that sometimes calmed me. I remember telling myself I would only study a bit more, then get some sleep, but time slipped away. Before I knew it, the clock on my phone showed 2:30 a.m. My roommate Carl had gone home for the weekend, leaving me alone. Our room was on the third floor of an old dorm building. The place had a classic university charm, with creaky floors and tall windows that let in a lot of light during the day. But at night, especially so late, everything turned eerily quiet. Most of the students in the dorm seemed to be sleeping. The hallway outside was silent, lit only by a few faint overhead lights that never got turned off. I sighed, flipping another page in my textbook, trying to force the information into my tired mind. Then I heard it, a light tapping on the glass. My first thought was that maybe a tree branch had blown against the window, but I knew the oak tree was planted a few feet away from the building. Its branches came close, but I had never seen them actually reach the window before. The tapping was gentle but distinct, like knuckles carefully tapping. I told myself it was just the wind, yet I could feel my heart beating faster. I got up, wanting to reassure myself. The window curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint glow from the lamp reflecting on them. I listened carefully. For a moment there was only silence. Then the tapping returned, a bit louder this time. Tap, 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 tap. My pulse quickened. I leaned forward, fingertips brushing the curtain. I paused, unsure if I had the courage to pull it back. Part of me was afraid I might see a face pressed against the glass, or something even worse. Finally, I yanked the curtain aside. Nothing was there, just darkness broken by a distant campus walkway light and the thick trunk of the oak tree below. My reflection in the glass looked pale. The branches made faint silhouettes in the dim glow, but they did not appear to touch the building. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe it was just the wind. I decided to crack open the window to check. Cold air swept into the room, and I leaned out a bit, trying to see if any branch could be scraping the pane. The thick, twisting boughs were at least half a yard away, though a few smaller twigs waved quietly. It would take a strong gust to push them all the way over. I saw no sign of any animal or bird that might create a tapping noise. The wind played softly through the leaves, but otherwise nothing seemed unusual. Brushing off my nerves, I closed the window and locked it. Still, there was a strange heaviness in my chest, like I was missing something obvious. I returned to my desk, forcing my tired eyes back to the notes. Maybe the stress of exams was making me jumpy. After a few minutes, I found myself rereading the same line of text over and over, my concentration broken. Pushing my chair back, I decided to go wash my face in the communal bathroom down the hall, hoping it would help me stay awake and clear my head. The corridor was empty. A single light flickered near the far end, where the bathroom sign glowed a dull yellow. My slippers made soft sounds on the old linoleum. Every door I passed was shut, and no one stirred. I reached the bathroom and flipped on the brighter lights. The reflection in the mirror showed dark circles under my eyes. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock making me gasp slightly. On my way back, I paused by a window at the end of the hall. I could see the oak tree's upper branches near our floor. They stirred gently, no stronger wind now than before. I watched for a moment, letting my eyes trace the outlines of the campus buildings in the distance. Nothing moved aside from the slow sway of leaves. I told myself again it must have been an odd gust that caused the tapping. When I re-entered my room, I locked the door behind me, though it felt almost silly. On campus, people rarely locked their doors so early in the night, but for some reason, I felt safer doing it. I threw myself back into studying, forcing my mind to focus on the lines of text. Time drifted again. The next time I looked at my phone, it was nearly 3:15 a.m. The words on the page blurred together. My eyelids grew heavy. Suddenly, I heard it again. Tap, 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 tap. This time the sound was clearer, almost insistent. My skin prickled with goosebumps. The window was only a few feet away. I froze, turning my head slowly. The curtains were still open from my earlier check, so I had a partial view of the glass. In the dim glow of my desk lamp, I thought I saw a sudden movement. A faint outline that darted away from the pane, disappearing from sight. My pulse thundered in my ears. I got up carefully, my legs shaky. I tiptoed toward the window, eyes locked on the glass. Nothing. The shadows outside remained still. I pressed my face closer, scanning the view. A campus light from below cast a small circle of illumination on the tree trunk, revealing rough bark. If there was someone out there, I should have been able to see at least a silhouette. But the window area looked empty. Swallowing hard, I rationalized again. Maybe the old window had a loose frame that rattled in the wind. I had noticed no such problem before, but it was possible. Still, deep inside I felt certain that the noise was too measured, like actual taps made by a person who wanted to get my attention. I decided to shut the curtains, telling myself it would help me focus on my work. Out of sight, out of mind. With the curtains closed, I felt safer, though a lingering unease simmered in my stomach. I even turned on some soft music to drown out any strange sounds. Eventually, I managed to lose myself in studying again. The faint guitar chords and gentle humming from my phone's speaker gave me comfort. Maybe half an hour later, the tapping returned, louder and more frantic this time. I nearly tipped my chair in surprise. The sound was unmistakable. A series of quick knocks, like someone drumming their fingers on the glass. My heart pounded, and I jumped to my feet. The music suddenly felt insufficient as a distraction. The idea that there could be a person hovering outside a third-floor window made no sense. Yet I could not ignore the noise. Stepping forward, I slowly reached for the fabric of the curtains. My hand trembled. When I tore the curtains open, I could not help but let out a soft gasp. There, pressed against the glass, was the shape of a hand, pale, ghostly, and gone in an instant. It pulled away from the glass as soon as the curtain moved, leaving behind a single, faint mark on the pane. I staggered back, almost falling against my desk. My mind raced with disbelief. There was no ledge outside the window big enough for anyone to stand on. We were 3 stories high, with only the oak tree nearby, and its thickest branch was still at least a foot away from the window. My mouth went dry, and my only thought was that I had to leave the room. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the door, my body shaking from head to toe. Out in the hall, the lights still flickered and every other door was closed. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I leaned against the wall, panting. Should I knock on a neighbor's door? Should I tell the resident assistant? It was nearly 4 in the morning, but fear won out over any worry of bothering someone. I rushed to the RA's door, which was conveniently only 2 doors down from mine. I knocked softly at first, not wanting to scare them, then more insistently when no one answered right away. Eventually, a sleepy voice from inside asked who it was. I tried to keep my voice steady, explaining that I heard tapping on my window, that something weird was going on. The RA, a girl named Marisa, opened the door, hair messy, pajamas rumpled, eyes half closed. "You heard tapping?" she repeated, confused. "On the 3rd floor?" I nodded, breathless. She grabbed her sweater and followed me back to my room. I hesitated before pushing the door open, bracing myself for something startling. But the room looked normal under the warm glow of the lamp. I pointed to the window as if it would reveal all. Marisa walked over, parted the curtains, and peered outside. She saw only the same campus walkway light, the same oak branches swaying gently. I told her about the hand I saw. She gave me a concerned look, probably thinking I had dozed off and dreamed it. We both examined the glass, looking for smudges or prints. There was a slight patch of condensation, but no clear mark of a hand anymore. Marisa sighed gently. "Maybe you're just stressed. Finals, right?" She offered to stay in the room for a bit to calm me down. We sat in awkward silence for a while, me casting nervous glances at the window, her fighting to keep her eyes open. Eventually, she said she was falling asleep on her feet, but if I needed anything, I could knock again. She left, closing the door behind her, and I sat alone once more under the too quiet hush of early morning. Time crawled. I refused to turn off the lamp or close my eyes. Every shadow in the corners seemed to shift. I kept hearing phantom taps in my mind, though the window stayed silent. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the gap between the curtain and the frame, but it must have just been the reflection of my own frantic face. By 5 in the morning, I felt exhausted to the point of numbness. Maybe my mind had played a trick on me. Part of me almost believed it, but a stronger part remembered the pale outline of that hand. Nothing about it seemed like a half-asleep hallucination, yet I could offer no logical explanation. Deciding that sunrise would bring me some security, I put on a pot of coffee with my small dorm coffee maker, wanting to stay alert until daylight. Finally, the sky began to glow with the gray light of dawn. The campus lamps switched off automatically, leaving the oak tree a darker silhouette against the pale horizon. Birds started chirping, a sign of morning. I felt a sliver of relief. The sense of threat eased with each passing minute, as though whatever was out there could not withstand the sun. Around 6, I dared to peek again. Outside, the campus looked so normal grass glistening with dew, the large oak tree still and majestic. Students would soon be walking to their early classes. I wondered if I should talk to someone in the campus office about what happened. But what would I say? That I saw a ghostly hand at my 3rd floor window, tapping to get in? The day passed in a blur. I tried to sleep in the afternoon, but my dreams were uneasy. Nightfall came again, and I dreaded the possibility of a repeat. My roommate returned that evening, full of stories about his weekend. I told him a watered-down version, saying I heard weird tapping, but he laughed it off. "Bro, these old windows rattle all the time," he assured me. I forced a smile, but the memory of that pale hand was too vivid to dismiss so easily. Since that night, I have been cautious in the late hours, listening for the slightest tap or scratch against the glass. Sometimes the tapping returns faintly, but it never sounds as clear or forceful as that one time. I try to ignore it, telling myself it's just the oak's branches or the dorm's old frame settling in the wind. Still, I cannot help scanning the window for any sign of movement. The idea that something might be clinging to the bricks 3 stories up, just out of sight, still sends a chill down my spine. I do not have a full explanation of what I saw. Whether it was a restless spirit, a trick of the eye, or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I know for certain that when you live in an old building high above the ground and you hear tapping on the glass at night, there might be more than just branches swaying in the wind. Sometimes you open the curtain to find the window still empty. Other times, you catch a glimpse of something that should not be there, a pale shape pressing against the glass before slipping away into the shadows. In the end, I keep my curtains closed after midnight. I study in the common area whenever possible, where lights are bright and people wander in and out. If I must be alone in my room late, I leave headphones in my ears, drown out every tap and scratch, and pretend there is nothing beyond the glass but the old campus oak. Yet now and then, when a gust rattles the window, I pause and picture that ghostly hand. I remind myself not to look too closely, because if I do, I might see it again, waiting for me on the other side of the pane. I still remember the day I decided to explore the old rec center. It was a large building located on the edge of my neighborhood, surrounded by a chain-link fence. Everyone in town said it had been closed for years. I always wondered why it never got torn down. Maybe there was not enough money to demolish it, or perhaps it just slipped people's minds. Wherever the truth lay, the idea of a boarded-up gym with locked doors sparked my curiosity. One cool evening, I gathered my courage, hopped through a gap in the fence, and made my way inside. The sun was setting as I approached. The front entrance was blocked by rotting boards, and a sign read, "No trespassing." I found a side door that looked less secure. It had a broken padlock hanging open. The smell of dust and mildew hit me as soon as I slipped through the doorway. Inside, the corridor was dark, lit only by patches of faint orange sunlight streaming through grimy windows. Broken vending machines stood along the wall, their glass cracked. Old snack wrappers scattered on the floor. My footfalls echoed on the worn tiles, reminding me this place had once been alive with activity. I kept moving, heart beating fast. I had never broken into any building before, even if it was abandoned. Part of me expected to find maintenance workers or security guards around every corner. But the entire rec center seemed deserted, as if nobody had bothered to step foot here for a long time. The wind outside rattled the loose doors, creating eerie sounds in the empty halls. I passed a locked office, peered through the dusty window, and saw only old desks covered by drop cloths. Eventually, I arrived at a set of double doors with a sign overhead. Gymnasium, Courts A and B. My excitement grew. I used to play basketball in a modern gym near my school, so the thought of an abandoned court felt both thrilling and unsettling. I pressed against the doors. They squeaked but swung open. The space inside was huge, much bigger than I imagined. Rows of bleachers ran along each side, covered in dust and scattered debris. The faint outline of old team banners hung from the rafters, their colors faded over time. The sunlight no longer reached this part of the building, so it was darker. My eyes took a moment to adjust. The air smelled stale, like old rubber and damp wood. The floor was scuffed and covered in spots of dirt. Broken light fixtures hung overhead, some dangling precariously from the rafters. I clicked on my small flashlight, shining the beam across the wide court. It felt strange, seeing the painted lines and half circles where people once played lively games. I imagined the cheer of excited crowds, the squeak of sneakers, the buzz of the scoreboard. Then I heard it. A single, steady thump, the sound of a basketball dribbling. My flashlight shook in my hand. Thump, thump, thump. The sound echoed in the silence. It was coming from the far end of the gym, in the darkness near Court B, but that made no sense. This rec center was condemned. No lights were on. The place smelled abandoned, and I was supposed to be the only one here. I took a few cautious steps. The dribbling continued. a calm, deliberate rhythm as if someone was practicing free throws. The hair on my arms stood up. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed through the dark. The dribbling stopped immediately. That sudden silence felt heavier than any sound. My heart pounded and I almost turned around to leave, but I was too curious and maybe a bit too stubborn. Slowly I walked toward the far court. My flashlight beam swept across rusted bleacher seats, dusty basketball hoops with torn nets, and a large scoreboard full of busted bulbs. When I reached the dividing line between courts A and B, I shined the flashlight ahead. Court B lay in near total darkness. For some reason, the windows up high were boarded up more thoroughly. I squinted, trying to see. Nothing moved. Still, I felt a strange presence, like someone, or something, was hiding among the shadows. I called out again, but my words died in the silence. Fighting my nerves, I crept around the perimeter, passing an old storage closet. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a trembling hand, shining my light inside. It revealed only dusty basketballs on metal racks, a few deflated, others rolling gently on the uneven floor. No sign of anyone. Then, as I turned back toward the court, I heard that dribbling noise again. Thump, thump. But it sounded closer this time, maybe behind the bleachers. My pulse raced. I followed the sound, stepping between broken chairs and knocked over trash cans. The dribbling stopped again before I could pinpoint its source. I reached the back of the bleachers, shining my flashlight into the crawl space beneath them, nothing but dust and tangled wires. A chill crept over me. I had a weird sense that I was being watched, though I saw no one. The darkness pressed in from all sides. My flashlight felt too weak, a small circle of light in a massive room. I wondered if the building might be truly haunted. This thought made me shiver. Thinking I should probably leave, I headed back toward the double doors. Suddenly, another sound broke the silence, making me jump. The squeak of a sneaker on the gym floor. It was faint, but clear, the exact noise a shoe makes when someone pivots. I whipped around, shining the flashlight wildly. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. No reply, only a heavy hush. My eyes stung from focusing so hard in the dark. I decided to exit as quickly as possible. But as I neared the doors, I realized I could not just close my eyes to what I had heard. I angled my flashlight up toward the scoreboard, which hung above the center of the gym floor. That was when I noticed something strange. The scoreboard, though covered in dust, displayed a faint glow. I stepped forward, holding the beam steady. The numbers on the scoreboard were dark, but the scoreboard itself had a tiny flicker in its corner, almost like a dying light bulb. No electricity should be running through this place, I thought. The city shut off the power a long time ago. I felt a burst of fear, but also curiosity. Carefully, I pulled out my phone, turning on its light as well for extra illumination. I crossed the gym floor until I was directly beneath the scoreboard. Looking up, I saw a small control panel at the base of the scoreboard's metal post. A faint blinking light shone on it. Just as I moved closer, I heard the basketball dribble again this time, right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing across the floor. And there, in the center circle, I saw a basketball bouncing on its own. My heart lurched into my throat. With no hand guiding it, the ball struck the floor. Thump, thump, thump. Then it rolled slowly toward the corner of the gym, coming to a stop against the wall. I nearly dropped my flashlight. My mind could hardly process what I saw. I took a shaky step back, wanting to run, but also feeling rooted to the spot. A sound like a sigh drifted through the air. Then, the scoreboard above flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw digits flash across the display. 13. U. That made no sense. The scoreboard beeped, weak and garbled, then went dark again. That beep acted like an alarm for me. I bolted toward the double doors, heart hammering. The entire space felt hostile, as if something invisible had awakened. I fumbled for the handle, but the door seemed stuck. Panic gripped me until I realized I had to pull, not push. I yanked it open, stumbling back into the corridor. The door slammed behind me with a hollow echo. I raced down the hallway, not stopping until I was outside, gulping fresh air under the evening sky. The sun was almost gone, leaving only a red glow along the horizon. I realized I was shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I hopped back over the fence and reached the sidewalk, pausing to catch my breath. I tried to make sense of what had just happened. A ball dribbling by itself, squeaking sneakers with no owner, a scoreboard flickering digits in a building that had no power. That night, I told a close friend what I experienced. He laughed, suggesting vagrants or bored kids might have been playing pranks, but deep down I knew it was something more. The way that ball moved, slow and steady, made my skin crawl. I could not shake the feeling that a part of the old rec center was still alive, replaying some echo of the past. Maybe the final score on that flickering display belonged to a big game from years ago that never truly ended. Curiosity tugged at me, even as fear told me never to return. A few days later, I talked to a retired coach who used to work at that campus. He recalled rumors of an accident that occurred in the gym before it shut down. Some said a young athlete collapsed during a late-night practice, and though the details were murky, the story hinted that the place was closed soon after. The official reason was lack of funding, but local gossip suggested something more tragic. After hearing that, I stayed away from the rec center. Nights passed, and I could not forget the eerie dribbling and the scoreboard's glow. Once, I dreamed I was back in that gym, hearing cheers echo in the dark stands, the scoreboard lighting up with impossible numbers. I woke drenched in sweat. Now, whenever I pass the fence where the rec center sits, I glimpse the roof against the sky. A chill touches me, remembering how I felt inside those silent halls. The building still stands, decaying further each day. City officials talk about demolishing it, but nothing seems to happen. Sometimes I wonder if the old gym is holding on to its secrets, refusing to be erased. I have never returned, but part of me wonders if the ball still moves in that court. Late at night, if you linger near the fence and listen carefully, maybe you could hear the faint echo of rubber hitting hardwood floors, or see the scoreboard flicker with a final unrecorded score. If you do, take the warning I give. The silence in that abandoned gym is not empty. Something remains, something that thrives in the shadows, replaying a forgotten moment again and again, waiting for anyone who dares to step inside.